Hello, everyone, and welcome to Recipe for Reality Small Bites. I usually air these episodes during a Survivor season, but the end of the season of Survivor, my life just got so busy. I was rehearsing for a show, getting ready to approach the new year as well, so I didn't get to release the video I wanted to release at the time of the Operation Italy episode of Survivor 47. That is this video. That is the most iconic boots right before a finale. Now, the reason I didn't release it is because I didn't really know whether or not Operation Italy was the boot before the finale, since this was a two-part finale for Survivor 47. And then by the time the finale rolled around, this video never made its way out to release, so I just decided to scrap it. But it was a topic that I was so into, that I was so interested in talking about, that I was like, you know what, I'm gonna still release a video. It's just I don't necessarily know where Operation Italy falls, if it counts for this video or not. So we will address it when the time comes, at the point in the list where Operation Italy would be occurring. But this was a really interesting topic because we're not just looking at the best players booted before a finale, we're also not looking at the most favorite players booted before a finale, the people I like the most, more so just the iconic boots themselves. Like, what moments happened right before the finale that set the trajectory and made us want to lean in and find out, okay, how is this all going to conclude? And I think that's why this is such a great topic, because often the penultimate episode of a season will kind of set the tone for how it's going to conclude. Oftentimes it is that one last big move the winner makes before the end. It is also sometimes the big move that a player makes that others then kind of see them as this big dragon to slay in the finale. I think of like Jesse Lopez on 43. He didn't end up winning that season, but his penultimate episode before the finale is kind of what set him up to be in the position to be that dragon that needed to be slayed by the end. So I think the penultimate episode of any finale is always going to be one that sets up so much drama to come, and why I wanted to make an episode devoted solely to these boots. But let's first go through all the boots in Survivor history that I didn't include in my top 10, but that were eligible for this list. Obviously, there are some seasons where the boot before the finale, I didn't count it because of Redemption Island, because there were people returning to the game. It was hard to kind of gauge, like, okay, they might have been a boot before the finale, but technically they didn't get booted completely from the game because they still had a chance to come back. So seasons like Redemption Island, South Pacific, Blood vs. Water, Edge of Extinction, and of course Winners at War are seasons I didn't really think about for this project, because who's the boot before the finale? Is it the person who lost the duel? Is it the person who got voted out? Even though some of the people who got voted out, like Andrea, for example, came right back into the game. So I didn't want to include any of those seasons just to make it a little cleaner for this list. But let's start at the very top. Obviously, Dr. Sean from Borneo is the last boot before his finale. Obviously, an iconic persona, especially on that season. But I think with time, we don't really think about the Sean boot as anything particularly special, though his alphabet strategy is still one that I think about and it makes me chuckle from time to time. Elizabeth from Australian Outback, kind of an iconic figure of Survivor to get booted before a finale, even though the boot itself wasn't iconic. Same with T-Bird from Africa, Sean from Marquesas. Those are iconic figures that got booted before the finale, but their boots in particular aren't ones that I think are part of this top 10 list. Ted from Thailand, the less said about Ted, the better. Heidi from the Amazon was in consideration, obviously a huge character on that season. Same as Burton for Pearl Islands, another big figure, even though it technically was his second boot of the season, so I didn't count it. Julie from Vanuatu, a very important boot, obviously because it led to a really emotional final tribal council moment, also because it's Julie Berry, who went on to have a history with Jeff Probst. Karen from Palau, not necessarily one that made the list. Cindy from Guatemala, another one I liked but wasn't quite in consideration for this list. I didn't count anyone for Survivor Panama because it's kind of iffy. Is Suri the boot before the finale? Not really, because she ends up going home at the beginning of the Panama finale. So because of the confusion of, not really having a boot before the finale, I decided not to include Panama at all, though I think if Suri did count for this spot, she would obviously be on. Parvati for Cook Islands, an iconic figure, but not necessarily an iconic boot, in my opinion, on that season. Stacy from Fiji counts for this, but it wasn't going to make the list. PG from China, I love PG, but not quite enough to put her on the top 10. Same as Crystal from Gabon. This one was really close to making the list, but ultimately I only had 10 slots. Shambo from Samoa, arguably the next next biggest character on that season next to Russell Hantz, but let's be honest, any boot that isn't Russell Hantz's boot, and Russell Hantz didn't get booted from Samoa, not going to be necessarily a top 10er, so I don't think any boot from Samoa would have made this list. Rupert from Heroes vs. Villains, interesting because he is one of the last heroes booted, even though Colby does outlast him, so I didn't want to put that on the list. Jane from Nicaragua, she was the fan favorite of that season, but not necessarily a boot I think most people think about now. Tarzan from One World, one of my fan favorites, but not quite enough to make the list. Abby Maria, really tough cut. She was obviously the last boot before the finale on both her seasons, Philippines and Cambodia, but I don't necessarily think her boot was always the iconic part of Abby Maria getting blindsided. It was more so the idea of like, wow, they took out the person who was probably the biggest goat to beat in the end simply because they didn't like her both times. I think that just says a lot about Abby as a character. I love Abby as a character, but ultimately she did not qualify here for this list for me as one of my top 10 favorite boots before the finale. John from San Juan del Sur, obviously a huge boot for Natalie's story, almost made the list. Dan from Worlds Apart, just such an easy character to dunk on. Obviously not one of the more iconic boots before the finale, but still an iconic character on his season. Joe from Korong, this one was sad because it was a medevac before the finale, but ultimately I didn't pick it. Sunday from Millennials vs. Gen X, rest in peace. Love Sunday, not necessarily sure if her boot is the most iconic part of that season, though, on many iconic moments in that season. Ashley for Heroes vs. Healers vs. Hustlers, another one where I just find her boot to be one of the more forgettable ones, even though at the moment I remember it being a big boot. I also don't think she's one of the bigger characters on the season, so that doesn't help. Kellen for Ghost Island, I definitely considered this because I think next to Dom and Wendell, she was the next most likely person to win the game, but I think at that point we still knew it was probably going to be Wendell or Dom, so I'm not counting Kellen for this list. Christian for Dave vs. Goliath was a very tough cut here. I think him as a character, one of the most iconic characters of the game, but not necessarily one of the most iconic boots, especially of that season, where I think there are bigger and bolder and scarier boots of that season, like Gabby's boot, for example, is a more iconic one than Christian's. I think by the time Christian went out, it wasn't as iconic because it was kind of predictable. Same as Elaine for Island of the Idols. We knew her boot was coming when it did, and you could say that Dan Spilo was also kind of booted before the finale, so I just wanted to kind of ignore Island of the Idols altogether. And then as for the 40s, as for the new era, the 40s players that didn't make it on, Danny for 41, a great character, but not one of the more iconic boots, I would say. Jamie, 44, kind of a forgettable boot by now. And then Drew. Drew's boot in 45 was a big boot. It's just there were so many other new era representations and just in general representations of Survivor that I wanted to include. So now we are at the list itself, and kicking it off at number 10, I wanted to kind of just strike the elephant in the room right now while it's hot, and that is Genevieve or Caroline for Survivor 47. I'm putting them both on here because I think, the first half of the finale, yes, it was called the finale, so technically you could say that Caroline's boot was the boot before the finale, but really, if we're looking at just the final episode, then it is Genevieve as the boot before the finale, and that's why it's at number 10, because I'm not quite sure who the boot before the finale is. Is it Genevieve? Is it Caroline? But either way, two very iconic boots. I think Caroline's boot is much more iconic than Genevieve's. I think if we were looking at Genevieve's boot as the boot before the finale, if we're looking at the second half of the finale as the finale, then I think Genevieve probably wouldn't make the list, though still, like, the whole, Sam versus Genevieve, Sam kind of ratting out Genevieve's fake idol as fake, but then everyone kind of wondering, is that just a play in and of itself? Is Genevieve's idol really real? And are Sam and Genevieve trying to pull a fast one on us, with Teeny kind of believing maybe Genevieve's idol is still real, and they're just trying to make us think it's fake? Like, I think that whole intrigue was really fun to watch, but really, I mean, Caroline is the pick here. If this is the best, most iconic boots before the finale, then Operation Italy absolutely is that. If you're counting the first half of the finale as part of the finale, then I think you have to consider Operation Italy, and honestly, if Operation Italy was valid for this list, then I think it is in the top 3 or 4 most iconic boots, not just of the new era, but of Survivor period. I mean, the move that Andy, Sam, and Genevieve are able to pull, yes, it would have been more satisfying if it took out a bigger threat like Rachel, but I don't think it works on Rachel because she has an idol. I think Rachel winning immunity was the most important piece of this plan, even though it was originally conceived to get Rachel out. I think the fact that they were able to pull off this master plan against anyone in the majority, let alone a big power player like Rachel or like Caroline, who, while might not have been seen as a power player by the people on the audience or the island, I think just looking at her positioning in the game, Caroline was the most dangerous player at that point. I just don't think people realized it. So to take out a big threat like Caroline at this point in the game, major props to them. But because I don't think we can really figure out whether or not Caroline's boot is the penultimate boot before the finale, or if Genevieve's boot is the boot before the finale, because it's not really clear what the finale was this season. Survivor wants to tell us it was a two-part finale. I think most fans would say that just the second half was that second part was the finale in and of itself. Because of that, I'm just going to put it at number 10 to be safe. But moving on to number 9, an iconic boot that I think, in retrospect, probably wasn't as iconic because it really didn't lead to any intrigue in the finale. I think the winner of the finale was still going to steamroll the finale no matter what, but it is still an iconic boot, and that is Brenda's boot from Caramoan. Now, as I just said, I think Cochran would have won the season no matter what, but I think if anything, this just makes for a really harsh final tribal council, especially with Dawn, that I had to include it. I mean, some of the most iconic moments you think of from Caramoan, I think you think of this boot. I think you think of the, kind of rivalry between Dawn and Brenda, even though it didn't, as I said, have anything to do with the final result, because I think Cochran was going to win no matter what. I still think it was a really iconic moment, and I think it's one that I think when I look back at Caramoan, that is one of the things that kind of sticks out in my brain the most. And it's funny because Brenda is a very under-edited player for most of that season. I mean, her and Eric are severely under-edited, but in that last few episodes, I mean, Brenda becomes a focal point, especially Brenda's relationship with Dawn and the teeth gate of it all. So the fact that Brenda was cut by Dawn, it not only made for a really tense final tribal council with Dawn, but also it led to Eric's medevac. I mean, Eric was very malnourished, and I think the Brenda boot kind of just sent his mind in a tizzy and made him kind of pass out right before the finale, also kind of kicking off the finale with a really kind of sad medevac boot. I don't know. I think Brenda's influence on that season was deeper than the edit led on. Obviously, the edit in those final episodes was really significant, but the fact that Brenda was such a low-key player for most of the season, but still one that America liked enough to give her a spot in the top 3 fan favorite spots alongside Cochran and Malcolm, I mean, that says a lot about Brenda's impact and this boot in particular in the way it set up the finale, and it did lead for one of the most iconic final tribal council moments. And then moving on to number 8, a moment that was very similar, but I think this person overall had a bigger part to play in the season at large, and that is Big Tom from Survivor All-Stars. And it's a very similar thing to Brenda, where Brenda was so hurt by Dawn in that moment that it makes her boot iconic, and I think the same thing can be said for Big Tom, the way he was so betrayed by Amber and by Rob, particularly Rob, that it really set the groundwork for this finale. This finale about Amber winning is not really Amber's win as much as it is Boston Rob's loss, and I think a lot of that has to do with how they treated Big Tom and how they sent him out of the game. And I think Big Tom's blindside is one of the iconic old school blindsides because it does kind of set this darker narrative at play for the finale, in the fact that this was Boston Rob's season to lose more than it was Amber's to win. And I just think, the don't be stupid moment at the finale really stems from this big betrayal in the penultimate episode. And I think that's why this is one of the most iconic penultimate boots, because Big Tom was such a loyal number to Rob and Amber, and they had to cut him because he was the biggest threat to beat them. And then I guess you could say Rupert after that, but I think they had a way of taming Rupert, a way of getting Rupert out without making it so difficult. Whereas Big Tom, this was a very difficult blindside for Big Tom to reconcile. And I think that's what makes it all the more iconic in the grand scheme of Survivor, also because it led to Amber's win, which ultimately led to Boston Rob's win because it gave him the narrative seasons and seasons later in Redemption Island, and then further down the line in Winners at War. So I think Big Tom's blindside is not just iconic for the season of All-Stars, but it kind of is iconic for the overall Amber and Rob story that would not just transcend Survivor, but transcend The Amazing Race. It would transcend real life, the fact that they get married and have kids. I mean, I think Big Tom's boot is part of Boston Rob and Amber's legacy in the grand scheme of life itself, which I think is really cool, and you can't say that about a lot of the boots on this list. But moving on to number 7, another boot that kind of follows this bitter juror path of Brenda and Big Tom, and that is Trish on Survivor Cagayan. And this was a moment that, you broke my heart when Trish is kind of calling out Tony. The only difference here is that Brenda is wronged by Dawn. Dawn doesn't win the game. Big Tom is wronged by Boston Rob. Boston Rob doesn't win the game. Trish is wronged by Tony, but Tony still ends up winning the game. And I think that's what makes this boot a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more special, because Trish, even though she is so pissed off and so hurt, is still the one who votes for Tony at the end to win the game. And while, yes, Tony still wins by a lot of votes, it's not like Trish's vote was the deciding vote, I still think it's a really special moment in Survivor history, especially seeing Tony go on to be this 2-time winner of the game. I think Trish's blindside is one that was not only shocking because a lot of people thought she could pull it out to win the game in general. Like, a lot of people were predicting Trish as one of the top contenders to win. Trish and Spencer. I don't think a lot of people were looking at Cass or Tony because they were these big villains until the very end, when it became obvious, well, Tony's going to beat Wu here. And I think that also makes it a great blindside, and one that is really heartbreaking and really, really iconic in the end of the day, because of this bond between Trish and Tony, and the way that it set up this kind of final chapter for Tony, not only to win the game, but also to reconcile all the mistakes he made up to that point. And I think that's even more intriguing than Boston Rob and Tom, or Brenda and Dawn, because Tony ends up still winning the game, even though Trish was still so upset at him. Now that we've covered some boots that are kind of stemmed in, rivalries and betrayals, Big Tom and Trish and Brenda, all these people who were super pissed off at the finalists who cut them. Now we're moving on to one that is just kind of surrounded by controversy, but not necessarily to do with many of the players as much as it is the advantages. Listen, I give a lot of crap to Game Changers for very reasonable and valid reasons, but I think one of the more intriguing elements of Game Changers are the advantages, for better or worse. Obviously, we all hate the Suri moment in Game Changers, but right before that, I think because of the Suri advantage get-in, people don't remember the very iconic boot that happened right before it, and that is Michaela's boot from Survivor Game Changers. And I think it's because everyone remembers the Suri boot at 6 that no one remembers what happened at 7 involving Suri with the steal a vote, where Sarah gives Suri the steal a vote. Suri tries to take the vote from Sarah. Sarah says it's non-transferable, takes it, and then steals Suri's vote back. I just thought that was really great drama. And while Michaela herself being the boot isn't necessarily the intrigue of that vote, I think just because of all the turmoil that stems right before it, I was genuinely unsure of who was going to go home when they were casting the votes, especially with Suri's vote stolen. I was like, oh man, is Suri going to go home right now? Also knowing that Sarah was kind of leading the charge, also knowing that there were so many idols at play. Ty had 2 idols, and there was a legacy advantage still out there, which couldn't be played just then, but still, like, all these advantages of Game Changers made for a really hectic post-merge, especially around the 7 and 6 place range, obviously, as we saw with Suri going out with all those advantages used against her. And it's really upsetting if you are a fan of Suri or Michaela, and I definitely am, but it's still an iconic boot nonetheless, just because I felt like the post-merge of Game Changers, the Ozzy boot, the Haley boot, the Zeke boot, the Andrea boot, they were all kind of boring to me. There were some blindsides here and there, like Debbie's boot, but even then, like, I was just kind of like going through the motions with the Game Changers post-merge, and this finally felt like the rejuvenation that the post-merge needed, even though it came at the expense of a player I love like Michaela, even though it's not as iconic of a boot as her first boot in Millennials vs. Gen X, and because it kind of also set the downward trajectory for Suri, because after this, we find that she is kind of defenseless, I should say. Defenseless, is that a word? I don't know. I'm recording 2 of these today, but Suri kind of being left kind of on the outs in the next vote, even though she then doesn't get voted out in the next round to her own doing. It's because she doesn't have an advantage, but this round kind of sets the stage for what would be a really chaotic Game Changers finale, and I do think because the great moments of Game Changers are so far and few between, I think Michaela's boot at least shows something we've never seen before, trying to steal a vote and then it not being transferable, and then it kind of reminds me of 41 a little bit with Xander and Liana, where it's like, can I have this idol? No, but you can have this fake. It kind of felt like that a little bit. It was just kind of Sarah pulling the wool over Suri's eyes. So yes, I love Suri, but it was still a really cool kind of cluster F of events that led to Michaela's blindside. So I put it square here in the middle of the list. But the next 3 picks on the list are all going to be new era picks, because I think the new era especially has really done a great job of setting up the finale with such exciting stuff going on in the penultimate episode. So we're going to start off number 5 with a bit of a surprising one being all this low, because he was the biggest figure probably of the new era at large, and that is Q from Survivor 46. Now the reason this one is probably a little bit less predictable is because we saw every single vote come in for Q, and the intrigue was not who was getting the votes, it was would Q play the idol or not. And I think the fact that like we see every vote come through, it really makes that one moment where Jeff says, does anyone have an idol or advantage, so tense and so wonderful, because Q, the biggest character of the season, the person who's been targeted week after week after week as a backup target, finally gets the votes and feels so confident that he doesn't need to play his idol. It's just such a great kind of ending for Q's story. And while I think we all could have probably seen it coming based on the way the episode was edited around Q's boot, I just loved how this all kind of culminated. I think it was the perfect way to send off probably, as I said, the biggest character of the new era so far in Q. And I do think this kind of sealed his ticket for whenever he wants to return, whether it be Survivor 50 or onward. But this really is such an iconic boot that I think because Venus went home with an idol in her pocket, and Tiff went home with an idol in her pocket, and Hunter went home with an idol in his pocket, I think that kind of lessens this just a smidge, just because we had already seen so many players get voted off with idols in their pockets. So it wasn't a big shock when Q followed in their footsteps. But I think the fact that the last one to do so is the guy that obviously should have played it because he was the outsider, Q. Like, I think that is just so poetic in a really sad but also very entertaining way. So I'm putting Q here at number 5, but there are oddly enough 2 new era boots that are even more iconic. And at number 4, we're going to go with Omer. And the Omer boot is really special because this is really the move that Marianne seals her victory with. And I think that's the thing is, like, Omer and Marianne, they were a tight duo for most of the season, but even then, at this point in the season, we saw Omer trying to get closer with Lindsay and that bond really flourishing. We saw Marianne kind of rope in Romeo and bond with Mike a little bit. We didn't really know how this was going to go. The edit was looking like it was going in Marianne's favor, but Marianne didn't really have that move to back it up. And we were all kind of wondering, how is Marianne going to pull this out in the end? She's going to just rely on being a social threat, but then seeing her make this move to get out Omer, who was undeniably the best player out there, I just thought that was such a fantastic move that not only sealed her spot as the true contender to win the game, but also gave her that jury resume that they love to see, also made her even more of a great character because now she wasn't just a fun personality, but she was also one that had strategic chops to her as well. And I think that was really, really special. Now, I think the thing is that Omer, we knew for a while that Omer was being set up as the dragon to be taken down in the season. So it wasn't all that shocking that it fell on Omer. It was more so the shock of Marianne actually pulling it off perfectly with the right amount of vote splitting, the right idol plays, the right steal of votes and extra votes. And, she played every single advantage perfectly. And she aligned with the very right amount of people and made sure enough people were in the loop and enough people were out of the loop to perfectly execute it. And I think that's really, really special. And I think that's what makes it such an iconic boot. Yes, we knew Omer was probably going to fall at some point before the final 3, but I didn't know it would go down in such a savvy way as Marianne kind of getting him and sniping him out in this way. And then also topped off with the whole reaction of, was it you? It was me, and him kind of giving Marianne the props on the way out. That was really special. But my number 3 is one that is very, very similar. It's very much a betrayal. It's very much a blindside, but it is one that was also kind of heightened by the reaction and the fallout of it. And while this person didn't go on to win the game for making this move, I would say it's still the biggest move of the new era so far, and that is Jesse blindsiding Cody in Survivor 43. Now, I almost put this below Omer because, Marianne actually went on to win, and Jesse did not. But I think the actual boot itself is so much more emotionally impactful than Omer's. It was like, Omer's the biggest threat. It was so cool to see him get sniped out by someone who was underestimated. But here, we knew Cody and Jesse were inseparable the whole season, and to see someone turn and do it in a ruthless way, but also have this kind of mutual respect at the end with that handshake. I mean, it was just the moment that made it so special. And yes, Cody was a big threat to win. I don't necessarily think anyone was thinking he was going to be the winner of the season. I think by this point, we all kind of figured, Jesse would probably be cut early, Cody would probably be cut early, and it was going to be like Cassidy who ended up winning. None of us could have predicted Gabler, but I think despite the fact that Jesse wouldn't win this game, I think Jesse pulling off this move was just something that kind of hadn't been seen in the new era, really. I mean, we saw it a little bit with Shan getting cut by Ricard and stuff, but Shan was a villain. Cody was a hero. Everyone loved Cody. Cody was so smiley. It was almost like wounding a puppy, and it was almost kind of like watching, this really beautiful, brave, and lovely soul go out of the game. It hurt even harder for Jesse than it did for, like, Ricard blindsiding Shan, where those were 2 villains kind of one-upping one another. Here, it was 2 heroes, essentially, one kind of turning and becoming the villain and backstabbing his friend, and I think that's kind of why I do put it above Omer and Marianne. Omer and Marianne were close, obviously, but they was still met with a lot of laughter, a lot of, oh my god, I can't believe you did that. Whereas Cody and Jesse, there was a split second where I was like, wow, like Cody's gonna like punch this guy and become the villain right back at him, but instead he holds out his hand, he handshakes him, and it's one of those really poetic moments. And we've been talking a lot about poetry with Q and with Omer and now with Cody. Now, I do think, obviously Jesse not winning the game isn't gonna put this at the very, very top of the list, but in terms of the new era is concerned, like, this is the most iconic boot, not just before the finale of the new era, but probably the most iconic boot of the new era still, because it was just such a well executed move, but also one that was just so heightened by all the emotional stuff going on and watching these two friends have to eventually part ways. I mean, it was really, really tough to see, but also so epic, and still why I don't think 43 is the worst season of the new era, because I think this moment solidifies why it is at least one of the greatest endgame stretches we've seen. And yes, Gabler's a terrible winner. I don't like him, but it was still a very unpredictable finale. So I honestly think 43 ends much better than it starts. And I think partially a lot of it has to do with this moment and how it set the course for the finale. Moving on to number 2, though, we're back to the old school eras of Survivor. There was just one boot that when I think of like most iconic boots before a finale, this is one that always comes to mind. And it is kind of the whole episode being a downfall for this player in the same way that Q's episode was a downfall for him. And that is Coach from Survivor Token Teens. This whole episode is great, from Coach being exiled and then coming back and limping and then going up to the challenge and falling off of the challenge and screaming ah as he falls down the challenge, and JT and Steven and Taj and Aaron, all having very different reactions to it. Aaron couldn't give two shits about it. JT and Steven are kind of morally at a little bit of a conflict because they're like, I feel bad for the guy, but like, I don't know. And then Taj having so much sympathy for him. Like, it really is interesting to see how everyone else reacts to Coach. But this is such a Coach-centric episode where I think the boot is not a surprise. It's not a blindside, but it is an epic, iconic boot before the finale, because Coach is arguably the biggest character of that era of Survivor until Russell came in. I mean, I think from like, the post All-Stars to pre-Heroes vs. Villains era, there's only a few characters you could look at as bigger characters, and it might be like Parvati and Russell, but otherwise, it's Coach. Like, Coach is the figurehead of that part of Survivor history. I mean, he played 3 times within like 6 seasons, and I think it's because he is such, magnetic TV. And I didn't like Coach, but I think that's also part of it too, is in a similar way to Q, you might hate Coach, you might love to hate Coach, you might love Coach. I don't know. You might love Q. But just seeing them and their downfall and their comeuppance, and seeing them kind of spend a whole hour falling from grace, I mean, that is something that really takes art. And we saw it with the Rome boot in Survivor 47 as well. That's not a penultimate boot before a finale, so obviously it doesn't count for this list. But when the editors really just lean in on one player for an entire episode, we saw this with Banu as well in 46, like, it can really make for some interesting or polarizing TV. And I think this episode is one that if I ever want to get people into Survivor, this is sometimes one I'll point to. I'll be like, you got to watch this one, because it not only has some great challenges in that episode. I mean, I love the foothold challenge. I think it brings some drama and intrigue, but I also think just the whole exile of it, the whole arc of Coach, the whole downfall of Coach, and just the fact that Coach is such a larger than life player, and seeing him finally fall at the hands of all these great players, JT, Steve, and Taj, I think that was kind of just such an iconic boot, especially of the time, because he was such a focal point, and seeing kind of the main character of the season have this big send-off. Even in the other examples, like 43, I don't think Cody was the main character. I don't think Omer was the main character of 42, but I think here, Coach was the main character of Token Teens, at least to that point. JT would kind of take it over in the finale and be like the kind of face you associate with the season, but Coach was the face of Token Teens. So I think the fact that his whole boot episode kind of leads up to this big, emotional, character-driven arc and downfall, I think makes it a very fitting choice for the top of the list. But there is one person, and I know he knows who it is out there, and I know you all know who it is, who had to be the number 1 on this list. There was no more iconic boot before the finale. There was no iconic boot period in Survivor more iconic than this one. There is no more iconic scene or moment in Survivor more iconic than this one, and it is Eric giving up the necklace in Survivor Micronesia and getting voted out by Parvati, Suri, Natalie, and Amanda. And that is my pick for number 1. I really don't need to go into it. Everyone knows the move. If you don't know the move, you probably don't watch Survivor. If you don't remember the move and you watched it, how? I mean, this is one of the most memorable moves of all time, and I think it belongs at number 1 for a reason. This is the move that I think most people think about when they think of Survivor, period, let alone boots before the finale. And not only was it a great boot, not only was it an epic blow, an epic bad play from Eric to give away his immunity necklace, but it also set up the trajectory for the finale. We've been talking about how all these boots do set up the finale so well. I mean, you have Brenda setting up the rivalry with Dawn at Final Tribal Council, Big Tom with Boston Rob, Trish with Tony, Michaela going out and how that affects Suri going into the finale and giving Sarah that power trip going into the finale for Game Changers. Obviously, Q going out, that's more of a character downfall, same as Coach. But then Omer getting ousted by Marianne and putting a trajectory into her story. And then Cody going out and giving a little bit of an oomph to Jesse's story, only for him to fall all. But Eric, he's not only getting taken out by this epic alliance, but this is also partially why, we see Parvati being heralded as one of the greats of the game, because it not only put her game into trajectory to win the game and be this all-powerful female boss player, but it became, a legend. This whole move, this Black Widow Brigade, it became a legend alliance where we look at Suri on that pedestal. We look at Amanda on that pedestal. Natalie Bolton is probably the number one person people want to see get that second chance all these years later, because this was an iconic moment. And Natalie Bolton got very little confessionals this season, but because this moment is so iconic, I think people look at Natalie very iconically. And I think that's all because of this moment and this iconic boot. And I really can't go on more about it because so much has been said about how iconic it is. But honestly, I think Suri, Parvati, Amanda, and Natalie will forever have their names etched into Survivor history because of this moment, and frankly, so will Eric, because Eric had an epic downfall, and he is the reason it happened. Obviously, the women convinced him, but he's the one who decided to take that necklace off his neck and give it up, and for that, I have to give him kudos, because it created one of the most iconic moments of Survivor, and of course, the number one boot before the finale. So there's my list. It was a very interesting one. I was kind of going off the cuff for a lot of these. I didn't write down a lot of notes on them, because they are so iconic, so they're all so fresh in my brain. But thank you for listening to this one. I've got another video coming out a little bit later today where I'll be talking about my top 10 US Survivor players that I want to see on the US Traitors. So this is a little bit of a crossover given that the Traitors just started. I wanted to get this one out there because this was supposed to air alongside Survivor 47's finale, but now you're getting it here, and then coming up later today, I will be giving my thoughts for which 10 players I want to see on the Traitors US, and I will tell you right now, at least one of these players is on that list as well. You'll have to find out who that is later today. But thank you so much for listening to this. If you want, subscribe to this channel for more Survivor content. And of course, check out the Dill Pickle podcast where you can find these on audio forms. I know this is already in audio form on video, but I like to show you all the pictures alongside it. So give it a like, subscribe, stay tuned for more. We got lots of great stuff coming up in this year with Traitors, with Survivor, with Big Brother. A lot of fun stuff coming for Recipe for Reality Small Bites and the Recipe for Reality show proper that I host with my co-host Zach Love almost every week. So thank you guys so much for watching this one. Stay tuned for more.